Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be going over the Fear and Greed Index again. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. If you're unfamiliar with the Fear and Greed Index, it is coming from this white website here. I will link it in the description below in case you want to go check it out. It is a useful tool, I think, in just understanding when there's a lot of fear in the market, when there's a lot of greed in the market, and understanding that we sort of just there's a pendulum, right, where we swing from fear to greed and back and forth. And one thing to remember is that you can spend a long time in sort of the fear phase, and you can also spend a long time in the greed phase. And so just because you see it say fear or just because you see it say greed doesn't necessarily mean that, the price has to do the reverse of that emotion. Okay, so it is important to remember that. In fact, if you look at the chart here, you can see that last month, last week, yesterday, and today are all greed. And we know that Bitcoin has generally been trending higher throughout that entire time. So I like to take this metric. Here are the raw values for it and play around with it in a few different ways. But one of the things we can do is we can look at the price history for Bitcoin and color code it based on the Fear and Greed Index. And when you do that, this is what you get. Okay? Now, one of the things that is interesting to do is to look at sort of just the lower bounds and the upper bounds, right? So looking at like 0 to 20, and you sort of see where that comes in. And then also looking at 80 to 100 and seeing where those areas have historically hit. And what's interesting is you can see that in 2019, once we got into the 80s and 90s, that was sort of like a warning sign that the top was going to be in, the local top was going to be in within, just a few days. But on the other hand, in November, when we hit this area, there wasn't really a substantial pullback. We hit it at 15K. There wasn't even a really substantial pullback until we went all the way up to 40K and then came back down. We also hit it right here in August of 2020, but we actually did get about a 20% drop. So you could say it was somewhat useful. So we have to be aware that some of the times we go into a move where the greed stays like that for a few months, while other times it only stays like that for a few days, like in late 2021 or in 2019. One of the ways that I like to visualize this as well is to just look at anything above 70. And this is the Bitcoin price on there, but it's kind of interesting to just take the price off and to just see what each of these runs look like and how some of them last for anything above 70. Some of them last for a couple of days. Some of them last for a few weeks, like in 2019 and late 2021, and where we already are today. And then you have the late 2020, early 2021 example where it lasted a lot longer. So the one thing that has sort of stood true throughout all of this is that when we get into the greed phase, we tend to stay in that phase for at least a few weeks, with maybe the exception of February of 2018. But in all these cases, like there are sometimes single dots, but once you start printing numbers in the 70s, we do tend to stay around that level for at least a few weeks. And you can see that in order to really sustain that level, the price has to continue to go up to sort of continue that momentum, right? The price will go up as people sort of pile in because everyone's super greedy and it's going parabolic, and everyone just sort of piles into Bitcoin. It goes far beyond what a lot of people think, and then it eventually tops out where, when the Fear and Greed Index is normally near extreme greed. So far this run, we haven't actually, hit the 80 to 100 threshold, but we are getting somewhat close. Remember, by the time we hit that 80 threshold over here in 2019, it was basically about 2 weeks before the local top was in. And it wasn't a top that we then spent 4 years, having to surmount or surpass. It only took about another year, or maybe about a year and a half, to get back up to those levels and surpass it. But it was an interesting level to look at. So when we take the color out of this and just look at the raw values, right? This is what it looks like. And what you'll notice is if you zoom in, we've basically been stuck between 60 and 74, 75. Between 60 and 75, basically since late October. And you'll see that this low over here on the fear and greed index was at 60, and then this one was at 62. Recently, we've put in a couple of lows here at 65. So this hasn't really moved in a long time. Almost going on 2 months now. So I suppose it really all depends on, what Bitcoin does here going into the end of the year and the beginning of next year. I know there's obviously been a lot of hype around various events and whatnot. I mean, not only do you have the halving next year in April, but you also potentially have the spot ETF approval, although that still remains to be seen. But it's nice to think about that sort of stuff before you get into the mix of it. Because, I mean, again, if it's rejected, obviously, it would seem more likely that there would be some type of sell-off because of that. If it's accepted and there's a rally into it, what I would be looking at, one of the things I'd be looking at is the fear and greed index. Are we going up into the 80s and 90s just like we went in late 2020, early 2021? And if that is the case, what it often means is there's some type of a cool-off period following that, right? Now, in 2019, I mean, it did not mean that we were headed to new lows. We ended up forming a higher low even before the pandemic hit. But it is something to sort of keep in mind that if we go into extreme greed, then it would be something to be on the lookout for. And, I think extreme greed is essentially defined as anything 75 and up, right? So, looking at the chart over here, I believe if it's above 75, it would be considered extreme greed. And so far, we've been unable to really durably break above that. I don't really even know if there's been a single print above 75, right? We've had some prints at 75, right? We've had some prints at 75, and you can see right there the classification at 75 is extreme greed. So far, we've been unable to break above that extreme greed, that threshold at 75. So if we are to break above it, then it could mimic something like what we saw back in 2019 or 2021. There's early 2021 and late 2021. But again, in all cases, if you isolate 70 and above, that's what they look like, right? We go into these rallies that extend usually into extreme greed. Sometimes they go much higher, sometimes they don't. If you look at 2019, extreme greed. 2021, extreme greed, up in the 80s and 90s. But in late 2021, you can see that it only went up into about 84 or so. So it didn't really make it all the way up into the 90s. Again, right now, the value is at 73. So if we get into 80s and 90s, again, a lot of times when you get into those levels, there does seem to be some type of a pullback, but we haven't reached those levels at the current time. One of the things to look at as well, I think, is to take a moving average, like a 30-day EMA, and kind of see where that is. Currently, the 30-day EMA is almost at 70. The 30-day EMA back in late 2021 topped out at around 71, 72. In early 2021, it topped out at around 92. It was actually before the highs. And then in 2019, in the pre-halving year of 2019, you can see that the 30-day EMA topped out at around 73 or so. Again, right now, the 30-day EMA is around 69.87. So it's approaching 70, not quite there yet. But again, because the value of the fear and greed index right now is 73, and it's still trending generally, in the 70s, this should start to continue to slowly increase as it has been. So that would be my general expectation with the fear and greed index. So if we do get a move by the fear and greed index into the 80s or 90s, I will provide another video on it. I know we've provided a few videos on the fear and greed index over the last couple of months, but so far, I just want to provide an update. I saw a couple of people, I know some people have talked about it, and it hasn't really moved, right? It really hasn't moved in about 2 months, right? It's basically just been between 60 and 75 essentially for the last 2 months. So if something like that changes, if something changes, we break above it, or if we break down, I'll provide an update on the fear and greed index. But until then, just know that this is where this is where it's been, and check in on this website over here, and you can sort of track along where if it actually does break durably into the extreme greed threshold. And I guess for us to get into extreme greed, Bitcoin would, the price would have to get back up to these prior highs for us to get back into the extreme greed. Otherwise, it'll likely just sort of stay flat until we get a breakout in one direction or the other. Anyways, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up. And again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. See you guys next time. Bye.